Well, that Sam's highs and lows in his career, the highs I think you can attribute to Dan Melnick. Because when Sam was at a low and it was unhirable, Dan Melnick was the one that came in and hired him. He did Noon Wine with Dan Melnick. He did Straw Dogs with Dan Melnick, and his relationship ended with Dan Melnick on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid because he took the producing role with James Aubrey to an extent that Sam fell out with him. But the highs were definitely attributable to Dan because Sam, on many occasions during his life, was unhirable because of his attitude towards studios, his attitude towards producers, his attitude toward and his actions towards the people that would hire him became almost impossible, and he was unhirable.
Dan, can I first ask you, when you first A, met Sam, or B, became aware of his talent as an artist working in film?
Well, I can't put a year on it, but Sam was responsible, was producing and directing and I think writing a wonderful half-hour television series called The Westerner with Brian Keith. And I think we were both nominated. I was doing some weekly television series back east, and I think we were both nominated for Emmys that year, and if I'm not mistaken, he won. And so I was very much aware of the show. Actually, it was a distinguished show, and I became an admirer of his during that period. And shortly after that show went off the air, I had acquired the rights to Catherine Ann Porter's novella Noon Wine, part of the trilogy Pale Horse, Pale Rider, etc. And I was going to do it as a 2-hour dramatic special for ABC, and I contacted Sam, who I didn't know, and asked him if he would like to write it and direct it. And he said he would love to, after the usual back and forth of it all. And we just plunged in together and found ourselves with a wonderful collaboration.
Was there a point at that time when he was conceived of as being a difficult director?
Yes, he was considered a difficult director at that time, but I suspect that was before his period of great difficulty and in the earlier period of troublesome. I think he evolved to difficult in the minds of the industry. And actually, we had a wonderful experience together on Noon Wine. It was very well received. And shortly afterwards, he went on to be replaced, to be set as a director on a film, which was The Cincinnati Kid, and replaced, for whatever series of reasons. And I was working on a feature called Straw Dogs. And I contacted Sam and I said I would like him to direct it. And Sam said to me, "Don't you know that I'm blacklisted and that I have a reputation for being so difficult, and I just got fired off this picture, and no one will make a picture with me and no one will hire me. Are you sure you want to take on this burden?" And I said, I remember saying to him, "All of those qualifications make you even more desirable to me."
How did that evolve? Because he had a hand in the script of Siege of Trenches Farm.
Yes, the novel we bought was The Siege of Trenches Farm, and the screenwriter that I had been working with and who had written the first 2 drafts for me was David Z. Goodman. And Sam, as a director who was also a writer, got very much involved in preparing the final shooting script. So he and David collaborated on the final shooting script.
This was his first experience of making a film out of America, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was.
Was this a subject of discussion? Can I just qualify that by saying there's one way of reading Straw Dogs, which is that it's a Western in a different context.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think that's very much part of what my thinking was. I'm not sure it was conscious or subconscious, but it was clear to me that the mythic elements, the primordial elements, were something that Sam would relate to very well because of his immersion in Western myth. As a matter of fact, when we started talking about it, one of Sam's early ideas, as I remember, was to set it not in the American West, but in Appalachia. And I can't even remember why we decided not to do that, but it was not a discussion that lasted very long, and we decided that we would set it in rural England. We didn't immediately settle on Cornwall. As a matter of fact, when Sam and I went over to start prepping the picture, including the casting of the film, although Dustin Hoffman was set before we went, everybody else in the cast was British. At one point, Sam and I divided the empire and communicated every other day. And I remember he was in Scotland, in that part of the country, and I went up to Cornwall, and he would call me and say, I found a great place in the Cotswolds. And I said, what makes it so great? He said, well, the name of the town we could use is Upper Slaughter. And I said, that's not a good enough reason, Sam. But at one point, when we were doing this location search, while all the other work was going on, Sam reached me and said, I found something really interesting in Scotland. And I got on my horse and went to Scotland. We had a wonderful 3 or 4 days, and it was truly a magnificent sight. And then Sam felt that there were production reasons from his point of view where the light, the fog, the rain was going to get to be a problem. And we ended up shooting it in the village of St. Buryan's, just outside of St. Ives in Cornwall.
It's an extremely violent film. And
you noticed.
At that point, obviously, Sam did have a reputation for being able to deal with that.
Yes.
Nonetheless, as producer and
Excuse me.
progenitor of the project, what was your feeling when the violence almost took on a life of its own in that film? Could you talk a bit?
Well, it was very much the intention. It was very interesting about the film, and I learned a really valuable lesson. There were 3 prime movers in the creation of the film: Sam, David Z. Goodman, the writer, and myself, and then of course Dustin once he started to make it real as an actor. Each of us had a slightly different intention in terms of the, if you will, subtext of the film. Sam was making a story about violence. I was very interested. My point of view about it was to tell a story about a man who is afraid to face the violence within himself, which is a subtle difference, and they didn't preclude each other. But the lesson was that each of us were able to collaborate on a film having a slightly different subtext and yet all make the same film. So that the violence, that sense in the early sections of the film of the brooding, almost subliminal violence that erupts in the last sequence, very much informed the whole film. So it didn't take on a life of itself, of its own, as much as it realized the intention as only Sam could realize it.
Now, there were production problems in that film.
There are always production problems on films.
Particularly on Sam's films, perhaps?
Well, I would think Sam brought his own cloud with him in many of the films he did because he had trouble trusting people. I think one of the reasons that we got along as well as we did is that for some reason, perhaps contrary to what all conventional wisdom might have advised each of us, we found ourselves caring deeply for the other and having a fundamental trust. Because I knew that whatever whatever detour Sam might take, that his integrity in terms of the film would never be compromised. His integrity in terms of any number of other things could be compromised all the time. Sam was a paranoid personality and so saw goblins behind every bush. But there was, it was really quite extraordinary because we did have, whatever the problems were, they were problems that you deal with all the time. There was great pressure from about the second half of the shoot on as Sam lost some time. The studio had the film, and the Bond people were getting very nervous. My job, I've always seen my job as a producer, one of my jobs, is to support the director and allow him to realize his vision. But it's always a very difficult road for the producer because you also have to be the responsible party in terms of what you agreed to make the film for. And with Sam, since there was a certain amount of game playing involved in everything, including Good Morning, the problems got exacerbated, and at a given point, the bond company, the insurance company that guarantees the cost of the film, in effect, got very, very nervous, and they had a director in the wings. That was Peter Collinson. I'm sure a very nice chap, not the man I intended to make the film with, and not the man I intended to finish the film with. So there was a presence. In fact, he was around for a while, not very long, and that added to Sam's tension. And what it served to do is mobilize all of us to make sure that the bond company never had the right to interfere. They could hover and perhaps even perform a valuable function by hovering. But we then did have a problem where Sam became sick during the making of the picture, and we had to close down for a few days. And Sam had a kind of constant upper respiratory problem. And I put him in the hospital, and his enormous resistance to be hospitalized was the fear that suddenly the picture would be taken away from him. So I think the only way I could get him to agree to go to the hospital was to give him my word that I would just stop operation, and that if he got into the hospital quickly and didn't develop pneumonia, we'd be back shooting in a few days, which indeed we were. But that created a great deal of tension on Sam's part, and there was the constant problem of Sam's drinking. And when we started the film, Sam had given me his word that he wouldn't drink, and he tried very hard not to. Sam's idea of not drinking was to only have wine before breakfast, and he tried very, very hard, and it was one of the few constant irritants between us, because I felt not only did I have to protect the picture, but anyone who's known Sam becomes very protective of him as a human being. So while I was trying to protect the film, I was also trying very hard to protect Sam from himself. Not the easiest of jobs. And Sam's penchant for game playing would extend to having two thermos bottles always at his side, with his wonderful aide, Katy Haber, in charge of them. One of them would have black coffee in it, and when I came by, he'd say, "Have some coffee, Dan." And for some reason, he thought I was naive enough not to realize that the next time when I saw the coffee being poured from across the stage, that this was the container thermos 2 that had coffee and brandy. But I just felt very strongly that, and he agreed, never to drink on the set in any way that was public, nor did he. And it was a constant problem, but one that Sam was wrestling with as his own private devil. And I certainly didn't want to be a policeman. What I wanted to do was make sure the film got all it was entitled to, and that Sam survived.
Talking about the one sequence which is memorable is the rape scene in Straw Dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was Marty Baum saying that nobody could have directed that scene like Sam.
No.
Do you have? Could we have your thoughts about how that developed?
Well, it was a chilling scene. When we had engaged the actress Susan George, she of course had read the script and agreed to the scene. And as we got closer to it, I think because she became really apprehensive about Sam and about the actors in the scene, she became, I think, quite terrified that instead of acting a woman who was being raped, she would be raped. And we reached an impasse, and there were, agents flying back and forth, and veiled and not so veiled threats going back and forth. And finally, I persuaded her that to do the scene as written, that she would, she wouldn't be endangered in any way. And the compromise was that she would do it as long as I was always present. Well, as a producer, I'm usually always present anyway, but the restriction of having to be present at every minute became burdensome because there are always lots of other things that have to be done in the next location or in another department, etc. But I found a very, very high ladder, an electrician's ladder, and perched on it. And I knew at the end of the second hour I was never going to get through the 6 days or the 5 days we were scheduled. And Susan was wearing G-string and pasties, and it was very tense for the first morning of the shoot of the sequence. By the afternoon, everyone was so relaxed, and Sam had installed confidence in her again, as only Sam could. He was the most charming man in the world. And suddenly, not only was my presence not required, I suspect that it wasn't wished for. And so that, but I was around, in and out, and it was never a problem after that. And the scene was an astonishing scene. I don't think there's many scenes that have been shot since of that nature that have been as effective, as tense, and as heartbreaking. She did a wonderful job, and the actors were extraordinary.
Some people would say that Sam's treatment of women in films, adopted a standard male chauvinist position, and might even cite that as an example. Do you have an opinion about?
Yeah, I think. Remember, we're talking about 21 years ago, before all of our consciousnesses were raised, and I think the phrase "male chauvinist pig" could have been coined for Sam. But that's only with the judgment of time. I think Sam had very complex attitudes towards women on and off the screen, and it was almost that classic Madonna/whore syndrome. He tended to deify women, and at the same time had a real tendency to denigrate them. And as an artist, he struggled with that. And as an artist, he made that work in terms of the reality of what he was doing. I didn't admire Sam's attitudes towards women, and I was probably less articulate then than I am now in my own rejection of them. But there was never any question that it was his own personality informing his art. It was never exploitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic. There's a personal story, isn't there, about a conflict with Sam where he threw something at you. Can you tell us about
Yes. One of the problems we wrestled with throughout the film was the very ending. It was, as very often happens on a film, there's one scene that troubles, and unfortunately this was the last scene, which becomes disproportionately significant, of course. And we had spent, every non-shooting hour talking about the ending. Sam, Dustin Hoffman, David Z. Goodman, who was there for a good deal of the time, and I. And we tried, 20 different variations, and had never satisfied ourselves. And the ending is, well, I'll come back to it. We never satisfied ourselves. And as we got closer to the time we were going to have to shoot that, it became more and more of a pressing problem. And one Sunday, Sam and I agreed to meet halfway between where he was living in Richmond and where I was living in Chelsea. We'd meet at the studio and try to once again talk through the options for the ending. We all agreed on the intent. We just couldn't find the mechanics to get there gracefully. And we were sitting in Sam's office, which was adjacent to my office. And Sam was behind a big desk that he had, and I was in a large club chair. And Sam kept a lot of things on his desk, including a machete as a paperweight rather. Now, Sam, I must interject, used to kill time, no pun intended, on the set by throwing knives at doors, at inanimate objects, hopefully. And as a matter of fact, after I realized that we were breaking up a lot of the sets over a period of time, I just started always having extra doors around. And when Sam had a break, I'd have them put up a door, and so he was really expert at it. And this particular afternoon, our discussion got heated, and one thing led to another. And Sam had been drinking, and it was Sunday, and he was entitled to drink if it was his wish. And it became very tense, and we each took very strong positions. And then Sam extrapolated from the discussion and got back to some production problem having to do with his hospitalization or whatever. And he got enraged and stood up and threw the desk over. And it landed at my feet, and I got up and started to walk towards the door to my office, and peripherally I saw that Sam picked up this machete, this paperweight that he had, and as I was going, I sensed, I suppose more than saw, that he had threw it. And I remember saying a prayer to a God whose existence I wasn't sure of, to not give him the satisfaction of having the machete land in the door and give one of those theatrical things. And it fell to the floor, and I picked it up and I threw it to him underhand, and I said, "Sam, there's some days you just can't do anything right, huh?" And by the time I was through the door, he had run after me and given me a big bear hug, and I said, "You know, you son of a bitch, I love you." And that was, an awful lot of what Sam did that became legendary in terms of his difficulty was not totally spontaneous. Sam had a very, very fine sense of the dramatic, and he was not above any ploy, any device, any bit of theatricality to get his way. And in this case, I think probably he was embarrassed that he dried up in terms of our discussion. And I think it was his frustration and not coming up with an inspiration that he felt he owed me as much as anything else that allowed him to stage the incident. And the fact that he could turn like that and, you know, give me the big hug and suggest that it was all a game, that he didn't really mean it. That was a very common thing with Sam. See, one of Sam's great qualities is he had the ability to convince everyone in his immediate vicinity, certainly everyone working with him, that he was the last man on earth, certainly the last man in the film business, with both guts and integrity. The truth of the matter is, Sam was as much of an opportunist as any filmmaker must be to realize the dream. Fortunately, he always had a great sense of humor about his behavior, so that at other instances, I remember there was a big drama one night when we were all playing poker. We were playing nickel poker in the hotel lobby, and Sam stomped out of the room and a thing, and in a display of really bad sportsmanship. And I went up to his room, and to call him on it, you know, because we were playing with some of the actors, and I was just embarrassed for Sam. And he said, I walked in the door and he said, "You think they bought that little play?" And he came down in about an hour and bought, you know, a pint for everybody, and it was all forgotten.
Do you think, It seems that there was an enemy, that Sam needed an enemy.
At all
Producers,
times.
the front office, the back office,
Yeah.
Can you talk about his need for...
Yes, Sam, because he was a paranoid type of personality, needed to invent enemies. Now, usually in the film business, you don't have to invent enemies because there are enough people who have very little else to do but interfere with the creative process. But Sam picked out his enemies and then worked against them. I remember Sam used to end every night by going up to his office and dictating memos. And I would get copies of them. And they would say things, they would be to his lawyer, Norman Garrett, back in Hollywood. And he would write things like, I lost 6 minutes and 14 seconds today because the wardrobe department wasn't ready. That kind of thing. And then, various complaints. And it was always about building a record to excuse so that he couldn't be blamed for anything. Now, of course, the director of a film is rarely blamed for anything except the film. And I remember saying to him one day, Sam, who do you think is going to read all this garbage? And he laughed and he said, well, I don't know, but it makes me feel better. And that's what a lot of it. But I think Sam also believed, because he had had such a litigious life in the movie business, and much of the problem of Sam's own making, that everything was going to have to be on the record for some mythical day of reckoning. And he did create. I mean, producers were his natural enemy, and I suppose that's one of the reasons that I set out to prove to him that as a race, producers are not necessarily evil people. And I think he came to that conclusion early on. But he had some very bad experiences before that and after that. I mean, being fired from a major film was a shocking thing. It does not happen very often. As a matter of fact, I believe when it when it did happen, Spencer Tracy, who was originally supposed to play the part that Edward G. Robinson played in this Cincinnati Kid, walked off because Sam was fired, and then I believe Katharine Hepburn, who was going to be in the film, walked off also, which is a great measure of support for a director, and it certainly solidified Sam's sense that everyone was out to get him.
How was he perceived by the Hollywood establishment in his mid-career, say, after Wild Bunch and Cable?
Well, I can tell you this: he was considered to be a very, very difficult man, and a man to be avoided. When it was announced that I was going to hire him, or that I was in the process of hiring him to direct Straw Dogs, I got 3 totally unsolicited and unwarranted phone calls, or maybe in the eyes of the phonee they were warranted, telling me what a terrible person he is, what a terrible mistake I would be making if I used him, etc. And of course, any attempt at blacklisting is so antithetical to everything I believe that the more people who told me that I shouldn't use him, the more absolutely determined I became to use him. But it's a very insidious thing, and Sam had created his own enemies. Some of them for real and some of them on spec. In terms of production problems, there was a very, very difficult problem early on. I had actually forgotten that. We had engaged an editor with great credential, and at the end of the second day, we got dailies, which was about 5-6 days into the shoot, because the rushes had to be sent from Cornwall to London and developed and then sent back and everything. The editor came to me and he said, this material won't cut. I said, what are you talking about? He said, no, it won't edit. He doesn't know what he's doing. I said, look, I've worked with Sam in an editing room. I've learned from Sam in the editing room, and actually learned a great deal from him in the editing process of Noon Wine. And I said, whatever may or may not ultimately be right with this film, I promise you, everything that Sam has shot will cut. He knows exactly what he wants. And the editor, who is, I'm sure, talented but very conventional, having worked for one of the knighted film directors of England, did the unforgivable. He called the studio, the financier, and said, "This director doesn't know what he's doing, this film won't cut." Well, the phone calls began. I remember you've got a time difference, so they usually hit me in the middle of the night. And hysteria was building, and as soon as I knew that I had to replace the editor. And hopefully I wanted to do it before Sam got wind of it, because then I would not only have to find a new editor, I'd probably have to find a good criminal lawyer. Sam did find out and was suitably enraged, and there wasn't time to go through the process of seeing what editors were available and talking to them. We had to make a very quick decision, and we had 3 editorial assistants on the film, 2 editorial assistants and a sound editor, and Sam said, and it was clear that the most effective thing to do was pick one of them. Well, it was early days, and Sam hadn't spent very much time with them. I'd spent a little bit more, and I made a decision and elevated the assistant editor to the role of editor. His name was Roger Spottiswoode. He's now a very, very gifted director. And the choice, I wish I could say that I was enormously perspian, and I knew that how talented he was going to turn out to be. The truth of the matter is, I had no real guide, and when I had studied film and film editing in school, I used a book that Roger Spottiswoode's father had written called Spottiswoode on Film, and that seemed to be some kind of omen, and it worked for us on this film very well, and Sam then used Roger on several other films, and they became good friends. But there was a case of someone not being able to attune to Sam's way of working, and the editor who made the complaint was not only was foolish, but he was without faith in the director, and shot the stuff in the beginning and the end just so the artist could have the rhythm for it. And so it may very well have been that in this editor's mind, the beginning of the shot couldn't possibly cut with the preceding shot, but it was never an issue for Sam, it was never an issue for me.
I'd like to turn to Pat Garrett, because my understanding is that at that point you had a different function and that you were to do with MGM,
right,
and you saw it from a different perspective.
Right.
Can you tell us from the MGM point of view, if you like, what was happening?
I was invited to come out to California to become head of MGM production, and Pat Garrett was in the works. In fact, I think, if not one of the reasons they offered me the job, one of the benefits they thought they would get is someone who knew how to deal with Sam. Unfortunately, the chairman of the company and Sam became natural antagonists the day that they both agreed to do the film. And it was a very unhealthy situation. Both of them were busy enacting a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sam was convinced the front office was going to screw him, and the front office was convinced that Sam was screwing them. So things went from bad to worse, and I came on and tried to bridge the gap, and indeed became the front office, except because there was this previous relationship and hostility, at best I could be a mediator. It was a fraught situation, and Sam did something that Sam, I think, had done in the past in his career, as it was clear that the fighting was going on and on and on, and because the head of the studio, the chairman of the company, had a reputation for taking films away from directors and producers, Sam became convinced that that's what was going to happen, and then it did happen. Again, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. But Sam did a version of the film. It was too long. He knew it was going to be recut. He sneaked screenings to people. It was really a terribly debilitating thing for everybody involved. I tried very hard to keep it going and to keep Sam working. I remember at one point I got thrown out of my own office by the chairman of the company because there was a scene in the film that involved a family floating down a river on a wooden raft, and someone is lying on the bank of the river very casually against a tree with a rifle next to him, and as the raft wafted by, he picked up the gun and fired, and 3 people on the raft fired back, and the chairman of the company barged into my office after he had seen that, and he said, "What the hell was that scene about?" And I said, "Well, Jim, that's a scene designed to really illustrate the existential sense of violence in the West." And he said, "Existential sense of violence? Get out of here." And I started to leave, and I realized, wait, this is my office. But it was a very, very difficult situation. I went down to Durango a couple of times, and of course, Sam, it was interesting because I was Sam's friend, and he knew I was his supporter. On the other hand, I was the front office, so he was in constant conflict about how to relate to me. But ultimately, I became one of the good guys in his mind, because I think he always really realized that at the end of the day, that was my relationship with him.
What do you think his great qualities as a director were?
His great strength was realizing mythic characterizations and mythic stories. He had a very, very unusual way of working with actors. Sam was embarrassed at the fact that he was highly educated and highly intelligent. It seemed to war with his own sense of what a Western man was about. And so he would avoid anything that vaguely approached intellectualization. Now, most actors need an intellectual, instinctive and also intellectual approach to understanding the role and the characterization. And Sam eschewed that, but what he did, which was very interesting and very, very subtle, he would relate to the actor in such a way, relate to the actor on the set, not while the take was going on, in such a way as to provoke the performance he wanted from him. And very often, I think, afterwards, actors might have thought, well, I didn't get very much help from Sam. I mean, the picture is terrific. He's got a great eye and a great sense of movement and all of those qualities that you ask about. But he didn't help me very much. The truth is, I think Sam helped actors enormously, but in such an unobtrusive way that they were not really aware of it most of the time.
If demons drove him, what were they?
Well, at the risk of seeming pretentiously psychoanalytical, I think his unresolved relationship with his father and his sense of his grandfather had a great deal to do with Sam's constant quest for manliness. I think that was a prime demon. He was totally, totally in awe of women, and his behavior, which could easily be interpreted as sexist, had to do with the fact of his love of women, his need for approval from women, his need to reduce women to people he could deal with comfortably, and his need to be perceived as a tough guy when he knew really what a pushover he was, and the fear of letting that show was one of the things that informed him.
And alcohol and drugs did what? Knock the edges off reality, or helped his sensitivity stay intact?
God, I've never been able to figure that out about anybody. See, Sam wasn't using drugs when I knew him professionally. I think he, and this is my recollection of it, I don't think he really became a serious user of drugs until he was told that he can't have another drink, that the liver was in its final stages. And I remember one trip I made down to visit him when Jason Robards called and said Sam's in trouble, and I went down to, I don't know if it was Mexico or New Mexico, I remember, and he was clearly in trouble then, and he swore to me that He was giving up all booze and anything else. And for 2 days, he kept telling me what a wonderful friend I was to come. And by the end of the 3rd day, when I was getting ready to leave, he said, "You son of a bitch, stay out of my life, leave me alone, I'll do whatever I want to do, and I don't need your help." But that was Sam. There's one thing that comes to mind. When we were finishing Straw Dogs, we had finished the film, and we were just getting ready to start the editorial process. And Sam came to see me, and he said, I've got to talk to you. It's very important. I said, "What is it, Sam?" And he said, "You're the only real producer I've ever worked with. You're the only creative producer, I think, in the business. And you're the only man I could ever trust with my film." And I said, "Sam, is what you're telling me is you got another job and you want me to supervise the editing?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Fine." And so what we did is we reversed roles. Sam went off to make a film with Steve McQueen. And I worked with the editors here in Hollywood on the editing. And then every 10 days or so would take the reels we've been working on down to Sam. And it was really the reverse of the way a producer and director usually work. It was a great opportunity for me. It was great fun. And I felt that my job was to realize Sam's intention in Sam's film. And because I was fortunate enough to have worked with him in the editing room extensively when we were doing Noon Wine, I felt I knew his rhythms, and I'd learned so much about, Sam cutting in motion, starting in the middle of a scene, and all of that. He was also quite phenomenal in the editing room. As hungover as he might be, or perhaps as much as he may have been drinking, we would have discussions, and he would say to the editor, "Bring me that piece of film that starts with her crossing over here, and then she sits on the sofa." And the editor would say, "No, that doesn't exist, Sam." And Sam said, "Look, I know it's there." And the editor said, "Would you take a look at the continuity sheets? It doesn't exist." And Sam would say, "For $10? And the editor would always make the mistake of saying yes. Sam would go over to the film barrel of all the discards, and he would put his hand in like this and pick it up. Now, I was enormously impressed. And I lost about, probably $150 to him in the process. And then I realized he was staging those scenes and had taken the specific piece of film in reference, put it in the barrel where he could put his hand on it, and had one more way of upping me. And of course, it was a game that I loved to collaborate in because he was just that good at it.
If he was back here, what would you say to him now?
Get to work, Sam.